Time in the Round by Fritz Leiber. Poor Butcher suffered more than any dictator in history. Everybody gave in to him because he was so puny and they were so impregnable. From the other end of the avenue of wisdom that led across the Peace Park, a gray, hairless, heavily built dog was barking soundlessly at the towering crystal glory of the Time Theater. For a moment the effect was almost frightening. A silent picture of the beginning of civilization challenging the end of it. Then a small boy caught up with the dog, and it rolled over enthusiastically at his feet, and the scene was normal again. The small boy, however, seemed definitely pre-civilization. He studied the dog coldly, and then inserted a thin metal tube under its eyelid and poked. The dog wagged its stumpy tail. The boy frowned, tightened his grip on the tube and jabbed hard. The dog's tail thumped the cushiony pavement, and the four paws beat the air. The boy shortened his grip and suddenly jabbed the dog several times in the stomach. The stiff tube rebounded from the gray, hairless hide. The dog's face split in an upside-down grin, revealing formidable ivory fangs, across which a long black tongue lolled. The boy regarded the tongue speculatively and pocketed the metal tube with a grimace of utter disgust. He did not look up when someone called, "Hi, Butch, sick 'em, darter, sick 'em." A larger small boy and a somewhat older one were approaching across the luxurious, neatly cropped grass, preceded by a hurtling shape that, except for a black hide, was a replica of Butch's gray dog. Butch shrugged his shoulders resignedly and said in a bored voice, "Kill 'em, brute." The gray dog hurled itself on Darter. Jaws gaped to get a hold on necks so short and thick as to be mere courtesy terms. They whirled like a fanged Mary. Go round. 3 more dogs, 1 white, 1 slate blue, and 1 pink, hurried up and tried to climb aboard. Butch yawned. "What's the matter?" inquired Darter's master. "I thought you liked dog fights, Butch." "I do like dog fights," Butch said somberly without looking around. "I don't like on-inch fights. They're just a pretend like everything else. Nobody gets hurt. And look here, Joggy, and you too, Hal, when you talk to me, don't just say Butch." "It's the Butcher, see." "That's not exactly a functional name," Hal observed with the judiciousness of budding maturity, while Joggy said agreeably, "All right, Butcher, I suppose you'd like to have lived way back when people were hurting each other all the time so the blood came out." "I certainly would," the Butcher replied. As Joggy and Hal turned back skeptically to watch the fight, he took out the metal tube, screwed up his face in a dreadful frown, and jabbed himself in the hand. He squeaked with pain and whisked the tube out of sight. "A kid can't do anything any more," he announced dramatically. "Can't break anything except the breakables they give him to break on purpose. Can't get dirty except in the dirt. Pen, and they graduate him from that when he's 2. Can't even be bitten by an uninge it's contra-programmed. Where'd you ever get so fixated on dirt?" Hal asked in a gentle voice, acquired from a robot adolescent. "I've been reading a book about a kid called Huckleberry Finn," the Butcher replied airily. "A swell book. That guy got dirtier than anything. His eyes became dreamy. He even ate out of a garbage pail. What's a garbage pail?" "I don't know, but it sounds great." The battling uninges careened into them. Brute had Darter by the ear and was whirling him around hilariously. "Aw, quit it, Brute," the Butcher said in annoyance. Brute obediently loosed his hold and returned to his master, paying no attention to his adversary's efforts to renew the fight. The Butcher looked Brute squarely in the eyes. "You're making too much of a rumpus," he said. "I want to think." He kicked Brute in the face. The dog squirmed joyously at his feet. "Look," Joggy said, "you wouldn't hurt an uninge, for instance, would you?" "How can you hurt something that's uninjurable?" the Butcher demanded scathingly. "An uninge isn't really a dog. It's just a lot of circuits and a micropack bedded in hyperplastic. He looked at Brute with guarded wistfulness. "I don't know about that," Hal put in. "I've heard an uninge is programmed with so many genuine canine reactions that it practically has racial memory." "I mean if you could hurt an uninge," Joggy amended. "Well, maybe I wouldn't," the butcher admitted grudgingly. "But shut up, I want to think." "About what?" Hal asked with saintly reasonableness. The butcher achieved a fearful frown. "When I'm world director," he said slowly, "I'm going to have warfare again." "You think so now," Hal told him. "We all do at your age." "We do not," the butcher retorted. "I bet you didn't." "Oh, yes, I was foolish, too," the older boy confessed readily. "All newborn organisms are self-centered and inconsiderate and ruthless. They have to be. That's why we have uningest to work out on, and death games and fear houses, so that our emotions are cleared for adult conditioning. And it's just the same with newborn civilizations. Why, long after atom power and the space drive were discovered, people kept having wars and revolutions. It took ages to condition them differently. Of course, you can't appreciate it this year, but man's greatest achievement was when he learned to automatically reject all violent solutions to problems. You'll realize that when you're older. I will not, the butcher countered hotly. I'm not going to be a sissy. Hal and Joggy blinked at the unfamiliar word. And what if we were attacked by bloodthirsty monsters from outside the solar system? The space fleet would take care of them, Hal replied calmly. That's what it's for. Adults aren't conditioned to reject violent solutions to problems where non-human enemies are concerned. Look at what we did to viruses. But what if somebody got at us through the time bubble? They can't. It's impossible, yes, but suppose they did all the same. You've never been inside the time theater, you're not old enough yet, so you just can't know anything about it, or about the reasons why it's impossible, Hal replied with friendly factuality. The time bubble is just a viewer. You can only look through it, and just into the past at that. But you can't travel through it because you can't change the past. Time traveling is a lot of kid stuff. I don't care, the butcher asserted obstinately. I'm still going to have warfare when I'm world director. They'll condition you out of the idea, Hal assured him. They will not. I won't let him. It doesn't matter what you think now, Hal said with finality. You'll have an altogether different opinion when you're 6. Well, what if I will? The butcher snapped back. You don't have to keep telling me about it, do you? The others were silent. Joggy began to bounce up and down abstractedly on the resilient pavement. Hal called in his 3 uningests and said in soothing tones, "Joggy and I are going to swim over to the time theater." "Want to walk us there, Butch?" Butch scowled. "How about it, Butch?" Still Butch did not seem to hear. The older boy shrugged and said, "Oh, well, how about it, Butcher?" The butcher swung around. "They won't let me in the time theater." "You said so yourself. You could walk us over there. Well, maybe I will and maybe I won't. While you're deciding, we'll get swimming." "Come along, Joggy." Still scowling, the butcher took a white soapy crayon from the bulging pocket in his silver shorts. Pressed into the pavement, it made a black mark. He scrawled pensively, "Keep on the grass." He gazed at his handiwork. "No, darn it, that was just what grown-ups wanted you to do. This grass couldn't be hurt. You couldn't pull it up or tear it off. It hurt your fingers to try." A rub with the side of the crayon removed the sign. He thought for a moment, then wrote, "Keep off the grass." With an untroubled countenance, he sprang up and hurried after the others. Joggy and the older boy were swimming lazily through the air at shoulder height. In the pavement, directly under each of them, was a wide, saucer-shaped depression which swam along with them. The uningests avoided the depressions. Darter was strutting on his hind legs, looking up inquiringly at his master. "Gimme a ride, Hal, gimme a ride," the butcher called. The older boy ignored him. "Aw, gimme a ride, Joggy." "Oh, all right." Joggy touched the small box attached to the front of his broad metal harness and dropped lightly to the ground. The butcher climbed on his back. There was a moment of rocking and pitching, during which each boy accused the other of trying to upset them. Then the butcher got his balance, and they began to swim along securely, though at a level several inches lower. Brute sprang up after his master and was invisibly rebuffed. He retired baffled, but a few minutes later he was amusing himself by furious, futile efforts to climb the hemispherical repulsor field. Slowly the little cavalcade of boys and uningess proceeded down the avenue of wisdom. Hal amused himself by stroking toward a tree. When he was about 4 feet from it, he was gently bounced away. It was really a more tiring method of transportation than walking, and quite useless against the wind. True, by rocking the repulsor hemisphere backward, you could get a brief forward push, but it would be nullified when you rocked forward. A slow swimming stroke was the simplest way to make progress. The general sensation, however, was delightful, and levitators were among the most prized of toys. "There's the theater," Joggy announced. "I know," the butcher said irritably, but even he sounded a little solemn and subdued. From the great ramp to the topmost airy finial, the Time Theater was the dream of a god realized in unearthly substance. It imparted the aura of demigods to the adults drifting up and down the ramp. "My father remembers when there wasn't a Time Theater," Hal said softly as he scanned the facade's glowing charts and maps. "Say, they're viewing Earth somewhere in Scandinavia around 0 in the B.C.A.D. time scale. It should be interesting." "Will it be about Napoleon?" the butcher asked eagerly, "or Hitler?" A red-headed adult heard and smiled and paused to watch. A lock of hair had fallen down the middle of the butcher's forehead, and as he sat joggy like a charger, he did bear a faint resemblance to one of the grim little egomaniacs of the dawn era. "Wrong millennium," Hal said. "Tamerlane, then," the butcher pressed. "He killed cities and piled the skulls." "Blood, bath stuff. Oh, yes, and Tamerlane was a scand of the navies." Hal looked puzzled and then quickly erased the expression. "Well, even if it is about Tamerlane, you can't see it. How about it, Joggy? They won't let me in either." "Yes, they will. You're 5 years old now, but I don't feel any older," Joggy replied doubtfully. "The feeling comes at 6. "Don't worry, the usher will notice the difference." Hal and Joggy switched off their levitators and dropped to their feet. The butcher came down rather hard, twisting an ankle. He opened his mouth to cry, then abruptly closed it hard, bearing his pain in tight-lipped silence like an ancient soldier, like Stalin, maybe, he thought. The red-headed adult's face twitched in half. Humorous sympathy. Hal and Joggy mounted the ramp and entered a twilit corridor which drank their faint footsteps and returned pulses of light. The butcher limped manfully after them, but when he got inside, he forgot his battle injury. Hal looked back. "Honestly, the usher will stop you." The butcher shook his head. "I'm going to think my way in. I'm going to think old." "You won't be able to fool the usher, butcher. You under 5s simply aren't allowed in the Time Theater." "There's a good reason for it. Something dangerous might happen if an under 5 got inside. Why, I don't exactly know, but something." "Ha, I bet they're scared we'd go traveling in the time bubble and have some excitement. They are not. I guess they just know you'd get bored and wander away from your seats, and maybe disturb the adults, or upset the electronics, or something. But don't worry about it, butcher, the usher will take care of you." "Shut up, I'm thinking I'm world director," the butcher informed them, contorting his face diabolically. Hal spoke to the uningess, pointing to the side of the corridor. Obediently 4 of them lined up, but Brute was peering down the corridor toward where it merged into a deeper darkness. His short legs stiffened, his necklace head seemed to retreat even further between his powerful shoulders, his lips writhed back to show his gleaming fangs, and a completely unfamiliar sound issued from his throat, a choked grating sound, a growl. The other uningess moved uneasily. "Do you suppose something's the matter with his circuits?" Joggy whispered, "Maybe he's getting racial memories from the scans." "Of course not," Hal said irritably. "Brute, get over there," the butcher commanded. Unwillingly, eyes still fixed on the blackness ahead, Brute obeyed. The three boys started on. Hal and Joggy experienced a vaguely electrical tingling that vanished almost immediately. They looked back. The butcher had been stopped by an invisible wall. "I told you couldn't fool the usher," Hal said. The butcher hurled himself forward. The wall gave a little, then bounced him back with equal force. "I bet it'll be a bum-time view anyway," the butcher said, not giving up, but not trying again. "And I still don't think the usher can tell how old you are. I bet there's an overage teacher spying on you through a hole, and if he doesn't like your looks, he switches on the usher." But the others had disappeared in the blackness. The butcher waited and then sat down beside the uningess. Brute laid his head on his knee and growled faintly down the corridor. "Take it easy, Brute," the butcher consoled him. "I don't think Tamerlane was really a scand of the Navy's anyhow." Two chattering girls hardly bigger than himself stepped through the usher as if it weren't there. The butcher, grimly, slipped out the metal tube and put it to his lips. There were two closely spaced faint plops, and a large green stain appeared on the bare back of one girl, while purple fluid dripped from the close, cropped hair of the other. They glared at him, and one of them said, "A cub," but he had his arms folded and wasn't looking at them. Meanwhile, subordinate ushers had guided Hal and Joggy away from the main entrance to the Time Theater. A sphincter dilated, and they found themselves in a small transparent cubicle from which they could watch the show without disturbing the adult audience. They unstrapped their levitators, laid them on the floor, and sat down. The darkened auditorium was circular. Rising from a low central platform was a huge bubble of light, its lower surface somewhat flattened. The audience was seated in concentric rows around the bubble, their keen and compassionate faces dimly revealed by the pale central glow. But it was the scene within the bubble that riveted the attention of the boys. Great brooding trees, the trunks of the nearer ones sliced by the bubble's surface, formed the background. Through the dark, wet foliage appeared glimpses of a murky sky, while from the ceiling of the bubble a ceaseless rain dripped mournfully. A hooded figure crouched beside a little fire, partly shielded by a gnarled trunk. Squatting round about were wiry, blue-eyed men with shoulder-length blond hair and full blond beards. They were clothed in furs and metal, studded leather. Here and there were scattered weapons and armor, long swords glistening with oil to guard them from rust, crudely painted circular shields, and helmets from which curved the horns of beasts. Back and forth, lean, wolf-like dogs paced with restless monotony. Sometimes the men seemed to speak together, or one would rise to peer down the misty forest vistas, but mostly they were motionless. Only the hooded figure, which they seemed to regard with a mingled wonder and fear, swayed incessantly to the rhythm of some unheard chant. The time bubble has been brought to rest in one of the barbaric cultures of the Dawn era, a soft voice explained, so casually that Joggy looked around for the speaker until Hal nudged him sharply, whispering with barely perceptible embarrassment, "Don't do that, Joggy. It's just the electronic interpreter. It senses our development and hears our questions, and then it automats background and answers. But it's no more alive than an adolescer or a kindrobot." "Got a billion microtapes, though," the interpreter continued. "The skin-clad men we are viewing in Time in the Round seem to be a group of warriors of the sort who lived by pillage and rapine. The hooded figure is a most unusual find. We believe it to be that of a sorcerer who pretended to control the forces of nature and see into the future." Joggy whispered, "How is it that we can't see the audience through the other side of the bubble? We can see through this side all right." "The bubble only shines light out," Hal told him hurriedly, to show he knew some things as well as the interpreter. "Nothing, not even light, can get into the bubble from outside. The audience on the other side of the bubble sees into it just as we do, only they're seeing the other way. For instance, they can't see the fire because the tree is in the way. And instead of seeing us beyond, they see more trees and sky. Joggy nodded. You mean that whatever way you look at the bubble, it's a kind of hole through time. That's right. Hal cleared his throat and recited, the bubble is the locus of an infinite number of one-way holes, all centering around 2 points in space-time, one now and one then. The bubble looks completely open, but if you tried to step inside, you'd be stopped, and so would an atom beam. It takes more energy than an atom beam just to maintain the bubble, let alone maneuver it. I see, I guess, Joggy whispered. But if the hole works for light, why can't the people inside the bubble step out of it into our world? Why, you see, Joggy the interpreter took over, the holes are one way for light but no way for matter. If one of the individuals inside the bubble walked toward you, he would cross, section, and disappear. But to the audience on the opposite side of the bubble, it would be obvious that he had walked away along the vista down which they are peering. As if to provide an example, a figure suddenly materialized on their side of the bubble. The wolf-like dogs bared their fangs. For an instant, there was only an eerie, distorted, rapidly growing silhouette, changing from blood, red to black as the boundary of the bubble sectioned the intruding figure. Then they recognized the back of another long-haired warrior and realized that the audience on the other side of the bubble had probably seen him approaching for some time. He bowed to the hooded figure and handed him a small bag. More atavistic cubs, big and little. Hold still, Cynthia, a new voice cut in. Hal turned and saw that 2 coal-dyed girls had been ushered into the cubicle. One was wiping her close, cropped hair with one hand while mopping a green stain from her friend's back with the other. Hal nudged Joggy and whispered, "Butch," but Joggy was still hypnotized by the time bubble. "Then how is it, Hal," he asked, "that light comes out of the bubble if the people don't?" "What I mean is, if one of the people walks toward us, he shrinks to a red blot and disappears. Why doesn't the light coming our way disappear, too?" "Well, you see, Joggy, it isn't real light. It's once more the interpreter helped him out. The light that comes from the bubble is an isotope. Like atoms of one element, photons of a single frequency also have isotopes. It's more than a matter of polarization. One of these isotopes of light tends to leak futureward through holes in space-time. Most of the light goes down the vistas visible to the other side of the audience. But one isotope is diverted through the walls of the bubble into the time theater. Perhaps, because of the intense darkness of the theater, you haven't realized how dimly lit the scene is. That's because we're getting only a single isotope of the original light. Incidentally, no isotopes have been discovered that leak pastward, though attempts are being made to synthesize them." "Oh, explanations," murmured one of the newly arrived girls. "The cubs are always angling for them. Apple polishers." "I like this show," a familiar voice announced serenely. "They cut anybody yet with those choppers." Hal looked down beside him. "Butch, how did you manage to get in? I don't see any blood. Where's the bodies? But how did you get in, Butcher?" The butcher replied airily, "A red-headed man talked to me and said it certainly was sad for a future dictator not to be able to enjoy scenes of carnage in his youth. So I told him I'd been inside the time theater and just come out to get a drink of water and go to the eliminator. But then my sprained ankle had got worse. I kind of tried to get up and fell down again, so he picked me up and carried me right through the usher. Butcher, that wasn't honest," Hal said a little worriedly. "You tricked him into thinking you were older, and his brain waves blanketed yours, going through the usher. I really have heard it's dangerous for you under-5s to be in here, the way those cubs beg for babying and get it." One of the girls commented, "Talk about sex favoritism." She and her companion withdrew to the far end of the cubicle. The butcher grinned at them briefly and concentrated his attention on the scene in the time bubble. "Those big dogs," he began suddenly. "Brute must have smelled them." "Don't be silly," Hal said. "Smells can't come out of the time bubble." "Smells haven't any isotopes, and I don't care," the butcher asserted. "I bet somebody'll figure out someday how to use the bubble for time traveling." "You can't travel in a point of view," Hal contradicted, "and that's all the bubble is. Besides, some scientists think the bubble isn't real at all, but I believe," the interpreter cut in smoothly, "that you're thinking of the theory that the time bubble operates by hypermemory. Some scientists would have us believe that all memory is time traveling, and that the basic location of the bubble is not space, time at all, but ever present eternity. Some of them go so far as to state that it is only a mental inability that prevents the time bubble from being used for time traveling, just as it may be a similar disability that keeps a robot with the same or even more scopeful memories from being a real man or animal. It is because of this minority theory that underage individuals and other beings with impulsive mentalities are barred from the time theater. But do not be alarmed. Even if the minority theory should prove true and no evidence for it has ever appeared, there are automatically operating safeguards to protect the audience from any harmful consequences of time traveling. Almost certainly impossible. Remember in either direction. Sis's was the butcher's comment. "You're rather young to be here, aren't you?" the interpreter inquired. The butcher folded his arms and scowled. The interpreter hesitated almost humanly, probably snatching through 250,000 microtapes. "Well, you wouldn't have got in unless a qualified adult had certified you as plus age. Enjoy yourself." There was no need for the last injunction. The scene within the bubble had acquired a gripping interest. The shaggy warriors were taking up their swords, gathering about the hooded sorcerer. The hood fell back, revealing a face with hawk-like, disturbing eyes that seemed to be looking straight out of the bubble at the future. "This is getting good," the butcher said, squirming toward the edge of his seat. "Stop being an impulsive mentality," Hal warned him a little nervously. "Ha!" The sorcerer emptied the small bag on the fire, and a thick cloud of smoke puffed toward the ceiling of the bubble. A claw-like hand waved wildly. The sorcerer appeared to be expostulating, commanding. The warriors stared uncomprehendingly, which seemed to exasperate the sorcerer. "That's right," the butcher approved loudly. "Sock it to him, butcher," Hal admonished. Suddenly the bubble grew very bright, as if the sun had just shone forth in the ancient world, though the rain still dripped down. "A viewing anomaly has occurred," the interpreter announced. "It may be necessary to collapse the time bubble for a short period." In a frenzy, his ragged robe twisting like smoke, the sorcerer rushed at one of the warriors, pushing him backward so that in a moment he must cross section. A taboy, the butcher encouraged. Then the warrior was standing outside the bubble, blinking toward the shadows, rain dripping from his beard and furs. "Oh, boy!" the butcher cheered in ecstasy. "Butcher, you've done it," Hal said, aghast. "I sure did," the butcher agreed blandly. "But that old guy in the bubble helped me. Must take two to work it." "Keep your seats," the interpreter said loudly. "We are energizing the safeguards." The warriors inside the bubble stared in stupid astonishment after the one who had disappeared from their view. The sorcerer leaped about, pushing them in his direction. Abrupt light flooded the time theater. Warriors who had emerged from the bubble stiffened themselves, baring their teeth. "The safeguards are now energized," the interpreter said. A woman in a short golden tunic stood up uncertainly from the front row of the audience. The first warrior looked her up and down, took one hesitant step forward, then another, then suddenly grabbed her and flung her over his left shoulder, looking around menacingly and swinging his sword in his right hand. "I repeat, the safeguards have been fully energized. Keep your seats," the interpreter enjoined. In the cubicle, Hal and Joggy gasped. The two girls squeaked, but the butcher yelled a hey of disapproval, snatched up something from the floor, and darted out through the sphincter. Here and there in the audience other adults stood up. The emerged warriors formed a ring of swinging swords and questing eyes. Between their legs their wolfish dogs emerged with them, crouched and snarled. Then the warriors began to fan out. There has been an unavoidable delay in energizing the safeguards, the interpreter said. Please be patient. At that moment, the butcher entered the main auditorium, brandishing a levitator above his head and striding purposefully down the aisle. At his heels, 5 stocky forms trotted. In a definitely pre-civilization voice, or at least with pre-civilization volume, he bellowed, "Hey you quit that!" The first warrior looked toward him, gave his left shoulder a shake to quiet his wriggling captive, gave his right shoulder one to supple his sword arm, and waited until the dwarfish challenger came into range. Then his sword swished down in a flashing arc. Next moment, the butcher was on his knees, and the warrior was staring at him open-mouthed. The sword had rebounded from something invisible and armed length above the gnome-like creature's head. The warrior backed a step. The butcher stayed down, crouching half behind an aisle seat and digging for something in his pocket. But he didn't stay quiet. "Sick 'em, brute!" he shrilled. "Sick 'em, darter! Sick 'em, pinky and witty and blue!" Then he stopped shouting and raised his hand to his mouth, growling quite unmechanically. The 5 ununges hurled themselves forward and closed with the warrior's wolf-like dogs. At the first encounter, Brute and Pinky were grabbed by the throats, shaken, and tossed a dozen feet. Warriors snarled approval and advanced. But then Brute and Pinky raced back eagerly to the fight, and suddenly the face of the leading warrior was drenched with scarlet. He blinked and touched his fingers to it, then looked at his hand in horror. The butcher spared a second to repeat his command to the ununges, but already the battle was going against the larger dogs. The latter had the advantage of weight and could toss the smaller dogs like so many foxes. But their terrible fangs did no damage, and whenever an ununge clamped on a throat, that throat was torn out. Meanwhile, great bloody stains had appeared on the bodies of all the warriors. They drew back in a knot, looking at each other fearfully. That was when the butcher got to his feet and strode forward, hand clenching the levitator above his head. "Get back where you belong, you big jerks, and drop that lady." The first warrior pointed toward him and hissed something. Immediately, a half-dozen swords were smiting at the butcher. "We are working to energize the safeguards," the interpreter said in mechanical panic. "Remain patient and in your seats." The ununges leaped into the melee, at first tearing more fur than flesh. Swords caught them and sent them spinning through the air. They came yapping back for more. Brute fixed on the first warrior's ankle. He dropped the woman, stamped unavailingly on the ununge, and let out a screech. Swords were still rebounding from the invisible shield under which the butcher crouched, making terrible faces at his attackers. They drew back, looked again at them. Bloodstains goggled at the demon dogs. At their leader's screech, they broke and plunged back into the time bubble, their leader stumbling limpingly after them. There they wasted no time on their own ragged sorcerer. Their swords rose and fell, and no repulsor field stayed them. "Brute, come back!" the butcher yelled. The gray ununge let go his hold on the leader's ankle and scampered out of the time bubble, which swiftly dimmed to its original light intensity and then winked out. For once in their very mature lives, all of the adults in the auditorium began to jabber at each other simultaneously. "We are sorry, but the anomaly has made it necessary to collapse the time bubble," the interpreter said. "There will be no viewing until further announcement. Thank you for your patience." Hal and Joggy caught up with the butcher just as Brute jumped into his arms, and the woman in gold picked him up and hugged him fiercely. The butcher started to pull away, then grudgingly submitted. "Cubs," came a small cold voice from behind Hal and Joggy. "Always playing hero. Say, what's that awful smell, Cynthia? It must have come from those dirty past men." Hal and Joggy were shouting at the butcher, but he wasn't listening to them or to the older voices clamoring about revised theories of reality and other important things. He didn't even squirm as Brute licked his cheek, and the woman in gold planted a big kiss practically on his mouth. He smiled dreamily and stroked Brute's muzzle and murmured softly, "We came, we saw, we conquered, didn't we, Brute?"